This week on Hope City Overtime, we take a look at the relationship between freedom and sacrifice, knowledge and love. This one's a little deep. Make sure that you like, subscribe, share it with a friend. Let's get it.
Welcome to Hope City Overtime, a weekly podcast where we take a little more time to dive into Sunday's message. And sitting here with Pastor Emma, who preached the 11:30 service, and Pastor John, who got 9 and 10:15, and Pastor Justin, who was there for the ride, like I was. It was fun. It was actually my first week. I got to be part of all 3 services, and it was awesome. Really feels like family. That's not really why we're here to talk today, but I enjoyed it a lot. We are right in 1 Corinthians. Feels right now like we're going to be there forever. We're 6 weeks in, right?
Six,
This
yes.
Week 6.
Yeah.
And we have 6 weeks to go, I think.
Oh my gosh, we're halfway.
Halfway through in chapter 8. Yeah, we're halfway
sorry,
there. We're going to get
I'm Bon Jovi-fying.
whatever YouTube does when you do music.
We're going to get flagged.
Yeah. Freedom. We talked about freedom and sacrifice and knowledge and love. And I love the way you guys decided to kind of break this thing down. So I want to start first with this picture of what it means to have freedom as children of God, because I think sometimes we get used to hearing that and we don't actually understand what it means to live free. So for either of you, whoever wants to jump in first, how would you kind of define freedom for the believer?
Yeah, so I think to understand what freedom looks like, you have to understand first what we are enslaved to. So when Jesus speaks about freedom, he's talking about freedom from sin. And so I think there's this beginning conversation, specifically with new believers, or even unfortunately, seasoned saints, that there's just this lack of understanding. You are free from sin and the bondage that sin tends to bring. And the product of that sin and bondage, of course, according to Romans, is death. So when Jesus says that you are free and he who the Son sets free is free indeed, he's talking about breaking those chains of bondage. And the way that he does that is by changing your identity. You go from enemy of God to now child, or a child of God, a part of the family. And that's actually on that passage in John, where you do step into sonship, which I love that picture. You step into relationship. It's an adoption. And in that relationship, it means you are no longer a slave to sin and to death. So that picture is relatively clear. Now, with that said, what Paul is addressing within the writings of 1 Corinthians is, as people are coming into the faith, freedom is this progression that first we become free from sin, but then there's some other things that we kind of still carry on. Some of these, what we would argue might be secondary issues that we're still trying to grapple with, still trying to come to the understanding of. So specifically in 1 Corinthians 8, he's speaking about food that's been sacrificed to idols and how some of the newer believers were struggling because in their conscience, food that was sacrificed to idols was off limits. So Paul's encouraging the church, yes, you are free to eat food that's been sacrificed to idols, but if you're with a brother and sister and they haven't come to that freedom, we must be willing to lay our freedom down in order that they do not stumble. And we see this incredible picture of cooperation between freedom and sacrifice. And that's kind of to answer your question.
Yeah.
That's
you took it and jumped right to the next point. So I'm just going to back up just a little bit. I promise we'll get to sacrifice. But one of the things that you pulled out passages talking about how we are no longer slaves, but we are children of God. And it reminded me of something that we talk about in the freedom curriculum. If you've been around Hope City for more than a minute, you know that we love freedom groups. And there's a whole week where you talk about the difference between being a servant and being a son. And so I just wanted to, as silly as this sounds, I have a background in teaching elementary, so we're going to sit on the couch, but talk through what are some of the characteristics of someone who is a servant or is a slave. And then we'll talk about the difference, what a characteristic is for a child. Because I do think that's something that we just kind of gloss over sometimes.
This is not going to fully answer your question.
That's okay.
I'm sorry about that. But I remember having like a really distinct moment with the Lord where I was praying for something or asking for something, and it was like I was begging. And I remember the Lord just kind of prompting my heart, like, why are you acting like a slave when you are my daughter? Like what? And the Lord doesn't like speak to me a lot like that, but just this picture of, I think, a slave in the house or anything like that, like, or just feeling like you're on the outskirts, like feeling like you're lower than, feels like you have to beg, feels like you have to fight, feels like you have to grapple, feels like, you know, that word to me is associated with just unrest and just like this deep despair. And why are you acting that way? Why are you putting yourself in that place when I have given you sonship? I have given you myself. Like, there's rest in that. There's peace in that. There's this, like, we use the picture of like the parental picture so much with the Lord, but truly it's one of the best ones. That there's just like this calmness in it. So it kind of answered your question.
Yeah. I think it's a great start. What are some other things that you notice characteristics of being a servant or being a slave? Because there's a little bit of different nuance there, but Paul uses both.
Yeah.
I'll kind of tie into actually kind of where I think where Emma was kind of getting at too is, so I volunteer at my son's school and for one of the clubs that he's in. And so every morning we'll get there and all these kids are doing their thing. And they know me enough as a volunteer now that like they'll come up to me to ask a question or whatever, but there's a process they follow. Mr. Leedy, can you help me find that? Like they're super proper about things. They want to be, you know, correct about things, as opposed to in that same club, my kid walks up to me, he's like, Dad, do you know where this is?
Yeah.
you like, so it's almost that formality of like, I get to be here versus I deserve to be here. And I know that's wiggly words there a little bit, but
Wiggly words.
I like
wiggly
that.
words.
I like that a lot.
I just, throughout the just different writings, one of the things that Paul is quick when talking about this slavery picture to sin, often he's talking about, he connects it to the flesh. And I do think that there is this thing we feel like we are slave to our flesh. Now, we've made that prettier in 2024. We've said things like, well, it's just really what my heart wants, or I'm not sure I can fight that urge. It must be who I am. And so you can see if we just change some of the vernacular, that's the slavery Paul's talking about. I have no choice but to act in my flesh. I have no choice but to gratify my sin nature. And Paul is quick to be like, no, you're a child of God. You are no longer slave to your emotional condition. You are no longer slave to the cravings of your flesh. So I think for the sake of this study, as we've been walking through it, Paul is specific to just let you know that's what we receive freedom from. And I think that's a good picture of what it means to be a slave.
So what would you say to someone who is walking with God and they still struggle with those things? Like, that's great. You're saying I'm free. I am a child of God. Why is this still a daily battle?
Yeah. So we got to be careful in kind of some of our language, because what we hope is as people are listening to this is real world. Let me be really clear with my language. It's not that we won't struggle with sin.
Right.
It's not that you won't struggle with that addiction. But I completely believe that there's relief and remedy and healing on the other side of whatever you're navigating through a right and proper relationship with the Lord, right? So there is hope. I think the difference between being slave to sin, slaves have no choice. They move lock and step. Being a child of God that's struggling against sin and still dealing with some of the weight and cruft of that sin nature is daily choosing to die to my flesh. Does that mean I win every day? No, it means that there's still struggle. There may be struggle. And quite honestly, even that idea of growing means that there's always, to some degree, some form of tension, because tension is how we grow, right? So to the person who's struggling with this every day, my only thing to you would be just remember who you are. And as you struggle, you hope that you get better tomorrow than you were yesterday. but that's the nature of what we would, a churchy word would be sanctification, that we're growing from glory to glory, that God is changing us and moving us to this, back to this identity as a child of God, living that in the fullness, but it doesn't mean that you won't have struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. It kind of reminds me, excuse me, of that nuance from last week of the difference between being someone who is wrestling with sin versus someone who indulges. And as weird as it sounds, because you almost think like indulging and slavery are opposite ends of a spectrum, really that indulgence does become a form of slavery, like when you do give yourself fully over. So it's like Paul's writing one continuous letter that's building on what he said before.
Well, and to your point, because I think this is important, often your indulgence will become the thing that you're slave to.
Yeah.
Like, you talk to anybody who's ever struggled with, whether it's an eating disorder or a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction. And at one point in life, it's just, oh no, we just like to do this. I get to do this. And that's why Paul's quick to be careful in our freedom not to sin, because on the other side of that indulgence, if we're not careful, that indulgence leads to back to slavery.
So now that we've talked a little more about freedom, sorry for not jumping straight into sacrifice. There is this responsibility that comes with freedom, but it's sometimes hard to understand because we're so individualistic. It's like, well, no, I've got it figured out. This doesn't bother me, so why wouldn't I stop that? Would you just kind of talk around? Sorry, it's not a totally formulated question. What it means to be free within the context of family?
Yeah. What it means to be free within the context.
Well, family, community, like that idea that we are a family of believers.
Okay. So let's go back to the story to add some clarity, because I think as odd as this story is, it does add quite a bit of clarity to what we're actually talking about, because I think sometimes we get a little confused here. Paul is speaking about food that's been sacrificed to idols once again. So he is taught across the board that this is now not a thing. They're still struggling with it. So he makes this comment that messes me up. He says, if what I eat makes you struggle, I'll stop eating meat altogether, because I would rather you not stumble and me deal with the sacrifice of not eating this meat. Like, it's not a huge deal to him. And I think that that's important to remember, because what Paul is not doing is Paul is not offering up his fundamental his fundamental belief structure. He's not changing the foundation of what he believes. He's talking about a very secondary issue.
And it's even just a little color commentary that I learned. This food was being sold in the market. It's not like people were going up to a temple and being like, oh, I'm going to take meat that's been sacrificed. The people would sacrifice it, and then the priests in these different religions, when they'd had enough, they would sell the excess in the market, and often it's the only meat people could afford to buy. So that just helped me understand, because you kind of think, well, when are followers of Jesus going to the temple to eat meat that's been sacrificed
to idols?
But it's just buying it in the market.
Yeah, so Paul is, I think our natural knee-jerk reaction would be, well, let's just get all these people in this room and teach this out of them. He is being graceful with their development of the faith, again, because it's not a primary issue. They're not, this isn't people he's not talking about worshiping idols. He's talking about food that's been dedicated, to your point. Freedom in the context of community means that there will be seasons of growing and seasons of understanding and wisdom that I've kind of developed over my umpteen years now of being a believer, that I have to be okay with people on their own journey and being willing to sit down with somebody. There's so many examples of this, but I'm kind of hesitant, because the minute I give an example, this becomes a conversation about that thing, and that drives me nuts. But I heard one minister one time said, if I'm reading through the word and I feel compelled to walk on my hands because that's somehow what Jesus told me to do, I'm going to walk on my hands. So when we read Paul saying, be willing to sacrifice in those freedoms that you have developed into in order that others wouldn't stumble, then that's what I'm going to do. If that means I become a vegan for, however long I need to be a vegan. I did that for like 3 days. It wasn't good.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it would.
But I do think that sacrifice picture is essential in family. But I mean, it's essential to even regular family. Like, I think the metaphor's there for sure.
Yeah, I even think, like, Jesus came down, modeled a life that we could, came down to show us how to do this thing. And even in his sacrifice is showing us that you will have to sacrifice. And we don't like that word because we don't like giving things up. We don't like being uncomfortable. But to your point, John, I think like if it really is becoming, if you're struggling with something and we're in community, I love you enough to be like, well, I want you to not struggle with this. So I'm going to cut it out too, whether it be for a week, a month, for indefinitely, however long it takes, because I'll sacrifice for you because he sacrificed for me. And there's nothing on this earth that can compare, or that is better than you experiencing that. So I just think it makes us so uncomfortable because we're just like, but it doesn't say like, but what do you mean? And like, it makes us so frustrated because we're comfortable people. Like, John and I were 7s on the Enneagram. We run from discomfort. We like comfort. And it makes us uncomfortable to think about giving something up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how well this fits, but it is kind of funny because when there's an emotional side to it, we're all on board for this, right? Like you think of the cancer patient who's getting their head shaved, and how many videos we see of the barber or their friends, whatever, stepping in line to get all their heads shaved. When there's that emotional connection that leads to a positive like that, we're all on board. We don't mind. I'll give up my hair for that because that's an amazing thing. But yet, in the context of spiritual growth, it does become, like you said, we're comfortable. We don't like giving up our comforts, and it becomes much more challenging in that.
Absolutely.
I would even argue, I haven't thought about this till in this conversation. In God's goodness, it's not only good for the person that you're sacrificing to help in their faith, but it's kind of a little test of idolatry in our own hearts. Like, if you're not willing to lay this down, like maybe you care about this more than you care about me. Like, speaking is from God's perspective, challenging us. Like, why is it that this is so important that yes, you have the freedom, but you're not willing to give it up for the sake of someone else? It becomes one of those just kind of like gut checks.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of a particular issue in my own life, but it's happened all the time. Like, it can be so many different things, even simple things like, my preference is to live alone, but there have been seasons where the right thing to do has been to open my home to someone and just
that's a great picture of it. I think we run to like really hot topics in the church, but it's like I love that you used this picture of like shaving hair. I didn't even think about that when I was like going through this message, but it's just like, if my friend is struggling with shopping, like, would I give up a shop? Like, it's just, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's we really go to like big ticket items, but we don't even think about the other things that.
It's kind of crazy, but we do get to this place of rigidity that you're sitting in my seat at church, or I can't believe that they changed the thermostat 2 degrees, or there's too many new people coming, and there's such a fight with our comfort level that we forget. Yes, we could keep everything the same. Yes, you can live in the freedom of us keeping everything the same, but the picture of family means that when a child is born, the whole house shifts.
Yes.
And
gives up sleep and
gives up
that's a great
sleep,
example.
right? But I speaking as a dad, I would never take back the experiences I've had with my boys for the sake of my comfort. That sounds ridiculous to me. So I do think that when we're rigid in our freedom, it creates this inability for us to watch and experience. Paul uses the phrase vulnerable believers. The NLT's translation of Paul's words are vulnerable believers. Other translations say weaker believers. Other translations actually are just new believers, just depending on the nuance. It's all there. But when people are new to the faith journey, it's like taking my boys and the first time they really jumped into a pool, or the first time they were on a train, the first time we went to New York and they saw the buildings, the first time we took them to I took them on a hike up a mountain, and the first time they could actually do that, like, before they were strapped to our back or they were on a stroller and we couldn't really, but the first time they could do that, did I have to go slower? Absolutely. Could I not take the riskier route? Absolutely. Did I miss the big waterfall at the top that I know is there? Absolutely. But to see them grab onto vines and branches and take steps. I'm living that through them. It reminds me of the joy of that thing. So follow me all the way through here, but I do think that often when we hear phrases like restore the joy of my salvation, it's because your freedom is so rigid. You're not watching as God brings salvation and freedom to those around you. You're not leaving space for those new believers to be close and are reminded of the goodness of God. I was in absolute brokenness this Sunday. I don't know what it was. It was at both services I was at. The Spirit of God was just doing something in me that had nothing to do with me. So if at any point I'm like, in my freedom, I'm not going to sit in this thing. Why am I feeling this? Like I can, but because of my desire to just be in the middle of that, I'm willing to hand over those freedoms to maybe say some things that make me feel a little embarrassed, or to have conversations that I'm a little uncomfortable with, to leave space for some of that because of the joy that I receive watching other people experience that freedom. So that's why sacrifice is so critical to the walls of the church.
Yeah, that's really good. So kind of connected to this, you talked about knowledge and love. And one of the things that I think hit the cutting room floor was a little bit of like the cultural value of knowledge in this time. Because I know you mentioned like that Gnostic idea that we talked about last week that's still kind of here in this. So is it right to say like knowledge was kind of the premium, you're given more respect if you're more knowledgeable, kind of more educated, that kind of thing, both within the community, the followers of Christ, and the broader culture in the area?
Yeah, what's crazy is so much of this is a cultural conversation, more so than even a spiritual conversation, right? So much of what's being described are hang-ups culturally. So the food to idols is a hang-up culturally. The idea of this superior knowledge. So we laughed because last week on Monday, we're sitting in this room and we're like, he put air quotes around superior knowledge. And Ashley, who I love, is like, I'm not sure.
I had a different translation.
She totally did. And look, hear me. That's what I need in rooms like that. Because honestly, I'm thinking the same thing. We can't run away with this. This will never make a sermon. It was almost like a joke. Like Paul said, superior
I was just
knowledge.
so confused. I was like, what are you talking about?
So he throws quotes over that phrase, superior knowledge, in the NLT. So we did a little bit of lifting theologically, walking through this. And I actually texted Ashley later on the week, and I felt a little silly because really it's in the verses like right above that I had read like 16 times, but the verses right above that, he actually defines that what he's talking about is this idea of supreme knowledge. And again, ultimately he's saying, well, what you know is people who say they know a bunch about this thing don't actually know as much as that they're saying. They have the supreme knowledge. So yeah, he's actually throwing up air quotes. He's being sassy, as Emma shared Sunday. But that idea of Gnosticism was that Gnostic philosophy was very much ingrained in the cultural identity of the city of Corinth. So we're not just talking about in the church. We're talking at the political level. We're talking in the streets. We're talking, this is the day where men and women would take to the city steps and communicate their philosophies in hopes that they would gather a following around them. Like this is, think Socrates and Plato and like those moments of just the sciences and just all this new information being developed and these people debating on these steps. So the ultimate value was knowledge. And Paul's warning is, yes, you should grow in knowledge, but it has to be within this relationship with love.
It kind of reminds me, I don't know why the Lord just giving me revelation sitting on this couch that I didn't hear yesterday. But when you tie it in together, it's almost like, well, bless their hearts to the more vulnerable or newer, weaker people. We know better, but they don't know, so they'll figure it out eventually. But we're just going to kind of leave them to do it. That same idea of knowledge coming into play of like, oh, it's a Southern thing. Bless their hearts.
Well, what made the cutting room floor is in Philippians when Paul talks about this, he actually says, he prays that your love would overflow so that your knowledge would grow.
That's cool.
And the relationship between love and knowledge is that knowledge should always be from the overflow of love, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where we get a little twisted. When you first come into the saving knowledge of Jesus and you're enamored with that love, it's the reason why so much of your spiritual growth and development happens right at the beginning. I'm just so obsessed with his love for me. I'm willing to know more. It's the same reason why the first time you fell in love with a person, you step into that relationship, you want to, I'm throwing air quotes around everything.
Were they not really
Why
a
not?
person?
Yeah, they're not really
If you're
a person.
only listening, John threw up air quotes on the phrase "with a person," and
Sorry.
I was just calling him on it. First time you fell in love.
First time you fell in love. In love.
In love.
Yes,
that's
that's
where the
really
air
what
quotes
it's
go.
Love with a person.
You remember those 16-hour conversations on the phone? You're just a basket of knowledge. Like, I want to know everything about you. Tell me your dreams. Tell me your hopes. Tell me your weaknesses. Oh my gosh, you do that? That's so cute. Like, we're obsessed because we're overflowing with love. Where knowledge becomes dangerous is where there's knowledge without love. We become, and according to that passage in Philippians, Paul's quick to say, beware the biting, beware of destroying one another.
I just couldn't get the picture of Nicodemus out of my head in this part, just because here's this man, and Nicodemus, if you're not familiar, is in the New Testament in the Gospels. And he's like heard all this stuff about Jesus. And finally, like he comes to Jesus at night. This is like Israel's teacher is what Jesus calls him. Is he has like the PhD of the PhDs, like super smart dude, comes to Jesus in the middle of the night. And that is like a whole other thing. And he's like, who are you? And Jesus is just like, well, who do you think I am? And Jesus is just like, shouldn't you know? And it's just that sometimes when we crave so much knowledge, and I think this is the thing, like sometimes in faith, we can get so wrapped up in knowing so much and wanting to know and wanting to uncover. And I don't think that's bad. I think it's good to constantly be evolving in your faith and knowing more things and evolving in your study. And all of that is beautiful. But Nicodemus is a picture of when you get too wrapped up in the knowledge, you come face to face with Jesus and you don't know who he is. You miss the whole point because your knowledge has in some way blinded you because you're trying to figure out how 2 + 2 equals this and like all of these things. And you see Nicodemus, and I didn't really talk about this in depth, but Jesus like tells him how to be born again. And he's like, what do you mean I have to go back into my mother's womb? Like, what do you mean? And it's just this, to me, I have held Nicodemus all year for myself. And even for my students, we're just walking through with our students, particularly at West, just walking through this idea of, I really just want you to love Jesus. I really want you to be able to recognize Jesus. I want to be able to recognize Jesus. So yes, I love knowledge, and I love when kids are telling me they're reading Dallas Willard and all of this stuff. And I'm like, but do you know him? Like, are you falling in love with him, or are you falling in love with the knowledge about him? Because when we think about in love with a person, I was going to say, are you in love with them, or are you in love with the idea of them? Right? Like, are you in love with Jesus, or are you in love with the knowledge that he gives you, or or in love with the idea of him?
Yeah, that's good. I feel like this comes up a lot. Not necessarily exactly how Paul's talking to it here, almost the flip side. I've had so many conversations recently because of the nature of where we are in this church season, and we're getting ready to launch groups next week with people that like, it's all over their lives. I can see that they love Jesus. I can see that they would be tremendous group leaders. And so often the first response is, I don't know enough to lead a group. So it's not even just that it's a warning for people who do have knowledge, not to let that get in the way of love, but it also gets in the way of building up the people around you that so often then the conversation becomes, I'm not worried about that. Like, we're growing together. All of us are still learning. But how many people discount themselves over knowledge, even still today, in the context of Hope City Church, is it makes me a little bit sad.
And interesting too, though, that as leaders, we'll look at someone who says, if you can love someone, I can teach you. We can, you can learn the knowledge. You can gain the knowledge. but we don't really think of it from the other side around. If you know everything but have love, we don't sit there and go, I can't teach you to love someone.
It's the harder thing.
Yeah.
It's definitely the harder thing.
Yeah. It reminds me of later in 1 Corinthians, so spoiler alert, but you know the wedding passage, the love is patient, love is kind, but the whole paragraph leading up to it, Paul lists all of these things. Like, it's not even just knowledge. It's like, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, and if I give all of this money to the poor, and if I do all of these things and have not love, then I'm just a clanging cymbal. Like, there's no value in it. And I think that's the heart of what he's saying here. Like, it's not that knowledge is bad, but it's that we can't pursue knowledge and value it above loving the people around us.
And because of the in the power of the Spirit of God that enabled these men to write these passages, you move to 1 John, and he goes a step further and says, hey, just by the way, when we're talking about love, we're not talking about this ethereal thought. God is love. So it's not that love defines God, it's that God is love. So all love is defined by the person of God. So here, when then you flip it and read it in that phrase, because I think sometimes I've struggled a little bit hearing, well, love is essential and love is primary. And like, yeah, but Jesus, what about Jesus? No. I mean, again, if you read it in the whole counsel of Scripture, these men are saying Jesus is love. Like, this is the definition of what love is. So it makes sense for your knowledge to be bathed in love. It makes sense for it.
I even think it's important to note, like, we're not saying that knowledge is like this horrible bad thing. Like, I'm sitting here thinking on this couch, you both have masters in this.
I'm a nerd.
We both went to undergrad at Southeast. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, we all have studied this to a level like that we have degrees in it. But even still, I think it's just the constant work of making sure that your love for knowledge never outweighs your love for him. And like, it's just, there is this, I don't know. I know I'm not the one asking questions, but like, John or Ashley or anybody, like, how do you do that? I feel like people would be listening. Okay, like, I do feel like I've valued knowledge a little bit more. Like, so what do I do? Like, I found myself in this place where I'm too wrapped up in X, Y, and Z, and like, oh, good. Like, what about the people that are like, oh my gosh, that's me.
This gets a little challenging in our current day and age because of our disconnection. If your wisdom or quote unquote knowledge is leading you to a place of hatred and bitterness and disconnection from people, you're on the wrong track. So I think for me, even in this passage, he says in Philippians again, which is another sermon coming eventually,
Philippians
I'm sure
2?
of it. Yeah, is it Philippians 2? But when he's talking about knowledge, he in that conversation, he's saying knowledge leads to blameless living, to purity. Like, there's this growth that happens in us when we pursue knowledge. So it is a honorable thing to pursue knowledge. But to your point, how you know the balance is when your knowledge is disconnecting you from people.
Yeah, that's exactly, like, literally what I was going to say was be around people.
Yeah.
Even having just done a master's degree, you could tell who was actively in ministry and who was like going straight from undergrad into this and had no experience. I think you actually brought up kind of a similar story about youth pastoring. Like, they might have all of this theory, but there was a little bit more pride in it than the person who, like one of my classmates who's been pastoring a couple churches for almost 30 years, being like, yeah, this is great, but what about in this situation? And it gets messy and it's not always black and white. And how do I love my congregation through this? And it's just the difference is that knowledge connected to people, or are you kind of sitting in that ivory tower?
It's the rock in the river that tries to control the flow. And at first it's proud and it's strong and it's rough edges and I know which way this river should go. Over time, people knock a lot of that off and you end up smooth. And I mean, that's the nature of experience and time and doing life alongside people. I don't even think that sometimes that maturation is a phrase that I would use or word I would use. I don't think that maturation, sometimes it doesn't require a lot of time. It just requires a lot of life. And sometimes life can happen in a moment. Like, talk to people who've walked through some things. and are connected to people, and you'll see that a lot of that haughtiness around what they know is just knocked off. It just is.
I love you brought up Philippians 2. I don't think that's what we were referring to earlier, but Philippians 2 is one of my favorite passages of scripture because it talks about Jesus who had everything, omnipotent, all knowledge, all power, who chose to take on the humility of being born as a baby in a manger, like not even more humble than our own. Probably, I don't know everyone's birth story, and we're not going to get into that on this podcast. but just, it's one thing to talk about this in practice and think about how we are being asked to live by God, but it changes it completely when you recognize God is not asking anything of us that he has not already given us far beyond what we are able to give. Like, it makes it seem silly to wrestle with some of these issues when you're like, oh yeah, Jesus gave up all of it. And then it wasn't just the humility to become a baby. He grew up and then he gave his life like in a super humiliating method. Okay, I can give up eating meat. Like, sorry for making this a big issue.
It's just crazy because you even think like in the humility and all of that, but then also in the surplus of knowledge that he had, like he was all knowing and all powerful and all of these things. And yet in so many spaces, particularly like in the Gospels and his conversations with the disciples who were just these rough and rugged boys for all intents and purposes, he's so gentle with them. He is so kind and loving. Now, Jesus is sometimes, and that's what I was going to say. Sometimes he gives it to them straight. Like, there is a place for knowledge, but if knowledge is at the forefront and love is in the passenger seat, like, it doesn't work. Jesus is always love, and love is sometimes a heavy hand at some points, like where he's always pushing people back. He can get a little spicy sometimes, but at the same time, it's always love leading him. And I think that is the exact picture of what he would want us, or what he tells us to do as well.
Yeah, I do think that there's a tension between knowledge and love, but just like ultimately my hope for Sunday was like these things, when optimal, they live in great relationship with each other. Like, you know, truth and love, we talk about it all the time. Truth and love, truth and love. It's not really truth if there is no love. But then it's not love if there's no truth to it. So I would say the same thing of love and knowledge. Like, the balance within the walls of the church is that I love you. We're going to create space. This is a place where you belong. But we're also going to look you in the face when we notice that there's things that are against that fundamental teaching, that foundation laid down by the apostles that lead to destruction. We're going to love you enough to gently, in the way that Jesus did, teach what's necessary for you to live right within the scope of the life that God has called you to live, and in that fullness of that identity of hope and purpose.
Yeah. So this is our famous segment, Cutting Room Floor. Is there anything that didn't make it into either of your sermons that you want to have a chance to share now?
For me, it was that idea of bathing, that knowledge bathed in love. We talked a little bit on the phone, and even in my studies, there's just this picture. Love overflows, but knowledge is growing. Growth is something that requires work. Overflowing is something that's just out of the product of the overflow, right? So when we're loved, that's why, like, even when I've always thought of that passage, when we're loved perfectly, there's no fear, because there's just this overwhelming sense of love. In the same breath, when our knowledge is bathed in that love, when it's overwhelmed by that love, I think that's where we can learn how to live pure and blameless and holy before the Lord. So there was some of that didn't make the cut.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I would say when we were on the phone and we were talking through this and you mentioned that, I was like, but you should put that in. Like, we should. Like, and on Sunday, I remember reading the verse and being like, should I say this? But it just wasn't like fully formed out. And you had also said that it might be coming up soon too. So it was just like, we're just going to leave this
keep that to the side.
That's the thing about Paul I'm learning in this study is there are multiple chances to hit the themes because he keeps building on it. So there's always like, oh, we're going to get back to that, which I guess makes Paul a good teacher, because when most of the people are listening to the letter instead of getting to read it, it's like, oh yeah, he's saying this thing again. So that's cool. Well, where are we headed this week?
Yeah, so chapter 11, Paul has this conversation around communion. And it's more than just a conversation around communion, but he uses the picture of communion as a way of correcting something within the walls of the church. There's this just disconnect. And this has been one of the verses that I've been waiting to preach, because he makes this statement and paints this picture of this divide. And basically he says that others of you come to this table and eat and get drunk while others starve. And it's such a compelling picture of where so many of us live in the faith, that we experience the beautiful nature of all that God is, and then we run to these bubbles of isolation and forget that there's people around us that are starving. So I cannot wait
To your point yesterday, Justin, you closed the service, and I loved what you said. You were like, is it fair to say that this series has been breaking?
Yes, that was the perfect word.
It was,
Yeah.
and it sounds like another breaking one, but out of that brokenness comes so much life. So I'm excited for it.
Yeah, it's going to be a great week.
We'll be here at Hope City West. Services are at 9 and 11:30, and at North 10:15. We'd love to see you at any of them. So see you Sunday.